Conspiracy theories abound on the left. Was the U.S. government involved in the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon? Are we being poisoned by the U.S. government from the skies in the form of chemtrails? All of these conspiracy theories and many more cross over between leftists and conservatives. Anarchist historian Peter Staudenmeier argues that they are profoundly harmful to a radical left project, substituting complex social critique with an intricate but deeply faulty web of explanation that ultimately disempowers. Here's Peter Staudenmeier on conspiracy theories.
When we are confronted with a social reality that gets reflected to us through the media, through mainstream newspapers, through television, et cetera, which we all know is an extremely restricted way of getting accurate information about the rest of the world, it can seem like drawing on these alternative histories and these alternative narratives about what's really going on, that can be a way of puncturing through that sort of mainstream, I guess you could call it censorship, or that mainstream domination about what we are allowed to think about, what we are allowed to believe about how the world works, and for that matter, the kinds of associations that we are allowed to engage in with one another. Sometimes when you want to get stuff done effectively, and the stuff that you want to get done is technically illegal, well then it's a good idea not to tell the authorities that you're doing it. And that puts you in, technically, a conspiratorial position. You're going to be working together with your comrades on some project or other, and you're not exactly going to go down to the local cop shop or the local district attorney and say, hey, just want to let you know we're working on this project and whatever. So a lot of us have direct real-life experience being effectively conspirators. And what I say in the rest of my remarks today is not at all intended to make light of or to, for that matter, to even criticize that kind of activism. It's the same thing that I do in my own activist life. What I want to do instead is draw on the other sort of subject to criticism and subject to a much stronger examination, is draw on the other side of that ambivalent legacy. And that's the side of the legacy of conspiracism within contemporary anarchist milieus that I think is actually dangerous, and is a temptation that we ought to be resisting rather than, allowing ourselves to fall into. I'm going to try to isolate about 10 different elements, very briefly isolate 10 different elements that I think animate the conspiratorial worldview as such, or what you might call the conspiratorial mindset. The first one I would say is a rejection of contingency. A rejection of the notion that some things happen for a series of reasons that aren't particularly clear-cut. In fact, sometimes things happen for reasons that we can't even determine with any precision or with any reliability. The conspiratorial notion is basically that seemingly random sets of events are in fact part of a grand design, that they were arranged to fit together into a certain pattern. Whereas I would say that in fact social reality quite often does not work according to anybody's design. It doesn't work according to the design of the powerful or the design of the powerless. It doesn't work according to natural laws. It doesn't work according to the laws of physics. It just works because social reality, as I'll get to in a moment, is a fantastically complex set of interlocking dynamics, and those dynamics don't always fit easily together. The second thing is that I think a lot of conspiracies posit a false dichotomy between, on the one hand, coincidence, and on the other hand, conspiracy. It has to be one or the other to a conspiratorial mindset. Either everything that happens is just utterly random chance. That's the sort of the bad kind of contingency. There's no meaningful connection between anything. Or the other possibility is it's all part of a deliberate and intentional and, again, designed sort of conspiracy. Everything is either sort of utter randomness, or it's premeditated and masterminded. And that leads us to what I see as a third misunderstanding of social reality within conspiracist frameworks, and that is a misunderstanding of both what contingency really means in a complex society like ours, and especially what intentionality means. There is often, I think, in our world, often a very common gap, sometimes a large gap, between the goals that people set for themselves and the results that they actually achieve. Even extremely powerful people experience an important gap between what they want to get done in the world and what they are actually able to achieve. And one of my hypotheses here is that conspiracy theory narrows that gap down until it just about completely disappears. Another way of saying that same criticism criticism of conspiracy thinking is to say that conspiracy theory does not account for fallibility. Even extremely powerful people, they make mistakes. They think that they're going to go into Afghanistan and get A, B, and C done, but in fact they go into Afghanistan and they get X, Y, and Z, which is not what they wanted to happen. That sort of fallibility I see as a constitutive element of the way social reality works today, and it's sort of the opposite of what you would think is really happening on the basis of reading conspiracy theory versions of reality. The fourth point would be, I guess you could call a difference between elaborateness on the one hand and complexity on the other hand. A lot of conspiracy theories look like they are very complex. They have lots and lots and lots of details. In a really genuinely complex society, which ours is, the kind of complexity in a society like ours means that the lines of causation are often not at all straightforward. It is often very difficult to figure out what caused what. But in fact, what caused what is not a simple question in a society like ours. Often, event X was caused by, 17 other factors, some of them really major, some of them apparently minor. It's very hard to draw any direct connections. You can't have a flowchart that explains our kind of social reality because a flowchart just has this one dimension. You have one arrow pointing from this discrete object to that discrete object. That's just not the way social action really happens much of the time in our society. Sometimes it does, but a lot of the time it doesn't. So I think that the conspiracy theory, while purporting to be more and more complex, is actually in a significant sense less complex than it would need to be. And next, I would say that one of the main sort of logical connectors, argumentative connectors that conspiracy theory relies on is the notion of plausibility. Very frequently, if you pay close attention to conspiratorial texts in particular, or even if you just listen to them on the radio, very often you will get this sense of, well, we actually can't demonstrate, we can't actually prove, we can't demonstrate any direct link between these 2 or 3 or 5 seemingly disparate events, but isn't it likely? Isn't it possible? Can't you see how they would fit together if you just accept that, figure X was in the right place at the right time and could have done what our theory suggests that she or he did do? So that notion of plausibility is really, really central to bringing the point home within a conspiracist framework. And that is closely related to, this is possibly the single most consistent and prominent element within conspiracist thinking, the notion that conspiracy theories very often rely on insinuation and innuendo instead of relying on evidence and argument. And what I mean there is that conspiracy theories will classically suggest a conclusion rather than stating it. That's the classic conspiratorial trope, is to suggest it to the audience, but don't necessarily actually state it outright. If you read a lot of conspiracist texts, like actually written forms of conspiracy theories, you will see a striking frequency of ellipses. Ellipses are when you have a ... like you're about to end a sentence, but instead of actually ending it, you just go ... That's a perfect example of suggesting the conclusion to the sentence without actually saying it. If you actually state the end of the sentence, then you have to sort of back it up and show how step 1 leads to step 2, leads to step 3, and they all support the conclusion that you're actually stating. If you avoid stating the conclusion, you can just rely on all the other elements we looked at and say, well, isn't it plausible that it could have happened that way? And you sort of invite the audience to draw the conclusions themselves without you actually having to put it forward. Next, I would say, and very closely related to that, is conspiracy theories often replace precision. They replace a precise analysis of difficult and intricate details with instead sort of, I guess you could call sort of arbitrary details. And here I do want to give a specific example. Have folks seen Michael Moore's latest movie, Fahrenheit 9/11? But there's one small point in that movie where you have this statistic tossed at you. 13% of the U.S. economy is owned by the Saudis. I don't know if it's 13% or 9%, I forget what the figure is, but you get this random detail sort of tossed at you as if it told you something really important about the world. And I'm watching the movie and I'm thinking to myself, 13%, I wonder what percentage of the U.S. economy is owned by the Dutch or the Belgians. I have no idea what percentage, but for that matter, I wonder the other way around. What percentage of the economies of the Middle East is owned by U.S.-based corporations? I'm betting it's higher than 13%, but again, I don't really know, and you're not given any of that context within Michael Moore's movie. Instead, you just have this 13% is owned by the Saudis. You have it sort of thrown at you. So I see that as an example of missing the point of a detail like that, because it's not really precise in that context, and it's just sort of free-floating out there, and instead you just sort of given arbitrary or random details. Now that leads us on to continue with the Michael Moore example. That leads us on to one of the really, really less savory elements within classic, standard, contemporary conspiracist discourse, and that is the idea that very often a conspiracy theorist will basically encourage the audience to draw their own inference. Again, don't state the conclusion, but just suggest it. And in order to help the audience to draw what the conspiracy theorist thinks is the proper conclusion, is the correct conclusion, conspiracy theories will very frequently invoke pre-existing preconceptions about particular groups of people that are presumed to be present in the audience's mind. The classic group onto which those existing presuppositions, you might call them existing prejudices, are then projected in conspiracy thinking is usually the Jews. But in today's world, it's very, very common to get a very similar sort of preconceptions projected onto different social groups. In Michael Moore's movie, the group that I see as sort of being the butt of all those preconceptions is Arabs. Muslims doesn't quite do the trick for his movie. In fact, Muslims is such a heterogeneous category that it doesn't quite do the trick for most conspiracy theorists, although some have tried over the last 3 years. But in Michael Moore's movie, it's more just this diffuse notion of Arab people. You see all these pictures of George Bush the elder, George Bush the senior, sitting down to coffee and shaking hands with and smiling with a bunch of Arab men. And all you know about them is that they're Arab men. Why? Because they look like Arabs. They're presented as Arabs. They're wearing those things that they wear. They have facial hair. And what Moore is doing is mobilizing a set of preconceptions on the part of his mostly white North American audience about what Arabs are like, and then using that pre-existing set of conceptions to invite the audience to draw the desired inference, namely that, wow, those Arabs and George Bush must be up to no good because, look, they're meeting in these secret places and they're all smiling and they're happy and they must be conspiring about something because that's what those shifty Arabs do or something like that. One element from that last example in Fahrenheit 9/11 that I think is important to highlight is that conspiracy theory very often invokes a logic of association. Not necessarily even, people are very used to the phrase guilt by association, but there's lots of other sorts of associational logic available to us. And not even necessarily guilt by association. Sometimes it can even be innocence by association, sort of the opposite. But in any case, it depends on this notion of a logic of association. And what I mean by that is that conspiracy theory will take a very complicated social reality as a whole, and it will focus on one part of that social reality, more or less in isolation from all the other parts, and then conspiracy theory will invest that one part of the complex whole with enormous significance, and will ask us to focus on this one, really, really important part of the entire whole. Okay, finishing up here. Another guy that I should mention who was actually a friend and colleague of Theodor Adorno's is a fellow named Franz Neumann. And Neumann wrote a very important essay about conspiracy theory again in the 1960s called Anxiety and Politics. And in that essay, he identifies something that he calls false concreteness. I really like that phrase. It's a good phrase. It's a perceptive phrase. False concreteness as a characteristic of conspiracy thinking. And what Neumann meant by that is that conspiracy theories very frequently will personify broad historical processes. That because it's really hard to talk in a direct and easily accessible way about things like, a phenomenon like patriarchy, which extends over thousands of years in a wild variety of cultural contexts and shows up in really, really, really different ways depending on the historical and cultural context, it's hard to talk about an underlying historical dynamic like patriarchy. It's much easier if we can personify that in the person of some identifiable, concrete set of bad people who are doing bad things. The problem becomes even worse, I think. Well, this is jumping ahead a little bit. But it becomes even worse in the case of broader social phenomena like capitalism, for example. In any case, Neumann's notion that false concreteness is involved is, I think, a a perfect way of describing what happens in a lot of conspiracy theories. They seem really concrete. They seem like, yeah, you can sink your teeth into that. You can get your hands around what conspiracy theorists say is really happening in the world, but it's a false way of presenting that. It's a deceptive way of presenting what's actually happening in the world, because unfortunately, a lot of what happens in social reality is hard to get our minds around. It's hard to sink our teeth into. It's hard to find really concrete and easily accessible ways of talking about it. My last point is going to be the notion of the telling detail. Conspiracy theory really depends often quite centrally on the notion of the telling detail. And by telling, I mean the one really revealing detail, or sometimes it's like 3 or 4 really revealing details. The notion there is that this one fact about social reality, once we have discovered it, once we have managed to unmask it, it will illuminate everything else that is supposedly happening behind the scenes. If you just pull on this one thread long enough, if you look at 9/11 and if you see that something weird happened that day at the Pentagon that just doesn't somehow fit into the rest of the narrative, which is certainly the case, even after that whole ridiculous congressional report about what happened that day, the whole 900-page thing, if you read through, I haven't actually read through all that stuff, but if you read through a lot of that stuff, you still are left with a couple of questions. How could they possibly be that stupid that they allowed that to happen, and how did this weird thing happen at that time, etc.? There's a bunch of unanswered questions that are hard to make fit into a coherent narrative. And according to a conspiratorial mindset, if you can sort of focus on one of those unanswered questions and you grab onto that thread and you just pull it long enough, the idea is that that alone will unravel the whole hidden structure, and eventually we'll be able to reveal, aha, what was really going on 9/11 was such and such and so and so.